Olunaku lw'eggulo omulamuzi w'ekkooti y'eddayo erisookerwako eya Buganda Road mu Kampala, Salatu Musiime Birungi, yasingisizza Munnamateeka Kenneth Kwesiga Bateyo ng'onaakola ne Kwesiga Bateyo Company Advocates emisango 12 okuli okujingirira ebiwandiiko, obubbi, okwekobaana okufera abantu, okujingirira ebyapa, wamu n'okuwa ebiwandiiko ebijingirire. Kkooti yasingisizza Bateyo omusango guno ne bannabaala 2 okwabadde Ssaalongo Kaggwa George wamu ne Sale Crispus. Okusinziira ku bujulizi obwaleeteddwa mu kkooti bano okusingisibwa omusango, kyazuuliddwa nti bano ng'ennaku z'omwezi 28 omwezi ogw'omukaaga omwaka gwa 2019 mu Kampala, Buffere Rashidi Ndawula okumuguza ettaka eryali ku bbulooka nnamba 269 ploti nnamba 349 Erubowa mu disitulikiti y'e Wakiso. Okusinziira ku bujulizi kiraga nti bano Rashidi Ndawula yabawa obukadde 330 okumuguza ettaka lino. Kkooti okubasingisa omusango guno kyaddiridde obujulizi obwaleeteddwa okuva eri omuwandiisi mu ofiisi y'ebyettaka Janet Nabuuma okukakasa kkooti nti ekyapa ekyogerwako ku ttaka lye baali bagenda okuguza Rashidi Ndawula nti kyali kijingirire.
I have taken into consideration the submissions by both the state and counsel for the accused stroke convicts, that is convict accused number 1, number 3 and number 4, Salongo, Counsel Bateyo and Chris. And on the side of the prosecution, I have considered the following that is the degree of coordination and planning as per the evidence on record, the determination to execute the offences with which they have been convicted. I've also considered the loss incurred by the complainant, although the exact figure in total in terms of loss could not be furnished, but court has considered the current Ugandan economy and the state in which it is, and the amount of money in total, the physical money that was taken away from him, that is 330 million, and the impact it could have had on the complainant. I've further considered the psychological effect given my many years in the courtroom as a judicial officer, that is 16 years, and the wisdom I possess to analyze and imagine the situation the complainant has been left in. I've also considered the lack of remorsefulness and negative courage, I called it negative courage, since 2019, with which the convicts have possessed. They were charged in 2019, and since then, they were very confident and courageous to have the case be prosecuted to the end without showing any remorse. I've considered the nature of the offenses with which the accused stroke convicts committed. Indeed, they are rampant. There's a lot of fraud, especially in the city, here in Kampala and the metropolitan. I've considered the position of accused number 3, Counsel Advocate Bateyo, his position as an advocate, a professional, and how the public expects him to have conducted himself towards the complainant as a person who trusted his expertise and his position, but which he did not, which he abused. He didn't use it in a wise way. On the other hand, on the side of the defense, I have considered the faithfulness with which the accused attended court. As I've said, they were very courageous, and most of the time they actually attended. As per the record, even at the time when I came in, this is a case that was handled by 2 previous judicial officers, and I came in as the 3rd. and the record said that it showed that most of the times they were in court, although in a few times they absconded, but it did not warrant a warrant of arrest. All the accused are said to be breadwinners, that is, also fathers, husbands, but who did not respect themselves as leaders of the basic unit of society, because we know that fathers are heads of families where they are, except for exceptions of families which are headed by women. But in an ordinary family, we expect a father, a mother, and if God has blessed them, children. So for these ones who were blessed to be leaders of the basic unit, they abused their position as fathers. I've also considered the time that has been taken in court by various judicial officers, including myself, in hearing this case, even spending sleepless nights writing this judgment. The medical report has not been relied on because it was not backed by the person who authored it. I have considered the age, to some extent, of accused number 1, Salongo, and Counsel Bateyo. They appear to be of advanced age, and also as per the charge sheets, they are above 60 years. I've also taken into consideration the fact that 10.5 million was, I've used the word retrieved. I'm not very sure whether it was returned by A3, but at least it was recovered from A3, and I can just say that it was returned, if that was the case, back to the complainant. However, I fault him for not entering into a settlement when he had considered, if indeed he returned and money was not retrieved from him, some money, that is 10.5 million, and not being able to use his expertise as an advocate of the High Court and other superior courts to quickly settle the matter out of court, especially when ADR, or alternative dispute resolution, is now the thing to go. I have taken into consideration also the constitutional sentencing guidelines for courts, but careful to say that sentencing guidelines do not override the discretion of the judicial officer. They can only guide, but they don't override the discretion of the judicial officer at the time of sentencing. This is because there will always be interests of justice that the justice demands some degree of flexibility. So being a judicial officer doesn't mean that you're rigid. I am flexible, but I will take into consideration the factors that I've highlighted. I've also considered, lastly but not least, the fact that A1 and A4, A1 that is Salongo and A4 Chris, were the masterminds of the whole fraudulent transaction that resulted into this case. They were the initiators.
Omulamuzi Salatu Musime mu kusindika bano ku kibonerezo, Munnamateeka Kenneth Bateyo amusindise ku kibonerezo kya kumala mu nkomi emyaka 5 oba okusasula engassi ya bukadde 25 ku musango gw'okwekobaana okufera omuntu wamu n'okufulumya ebiwandiiko ebijingirire.
That is procuring execution of documents by false pretenses contrary to section 353, 347 and 19, subsection 1, C of the Penal Code. That case attracts a maximum of 3 years. Because of the many factors I've already laid down, without repeating them, I'm sentencing A1, Salongo, A4, Chris, to 2 years in prison. A3, Bateyo, I'm sentencing him to a fine of 2 million and indeed for 2 years to give him a second chance to think about his profession. And in the case Bateyo fails to pay that money as a fine, he will serve his sentences concurrently in the case he fails to pay the fines. Any other clarification? Now in the count number 5, Count number 5 is conspiracy to commit a felony. That is to wait a sales agreement. The other one was making, but this one is now conspiracy. A1 and A2 are sentenced to 2 years. This is also attracting a maximum of 3, so I'm giving them 2 years, given the factors that I've already laid down. And A3 is still given a sentence of 3 million, and this is because he had all the professionalism to write and draft this sales agreement, but he used it in a wrong way. So in default, still has to serve 3 years.
Wabula kkooti esindise Ssaalongo Kaggwa George ne Sally Crispus ku kibonerezo kya myaka 10 mu nkomyo, era nga buli omu wakusasulwa obukadde 100 ng'engasi ku misango okuli obufere, okujingirira ebiwandiiko wamu n'okwekobaana okuzza omusango.
A3 Bateyo, I'm sentencing him to a fine of 2 million and in default 2 years to give him a second chance to think about his profession. In count 2 of conspiracy to commit a felony contrary to section 390 of the Penal Code Act, A1, it attracts a maximum sentence of 3 years. A1 Ssaalongo and A4 Chris, the masterminds of this case, are sentenced to 2 years each in prison. A3 is sentenced to a fine of 2 million and in default 2 years. I'm still giving him an option of a fine for him to get a second chance as an advocate and think again about his profession. Count 3 of uttering a false document contrary to section 351 and 347 of the Penal Code Act. A1 Ssaalongo, A2 Chris are sentenced 2 years for the same reasons of initiating the whole fraudulent scam. A3 Bateyo is still sentenced to a fine of 2 million and in default to serve 2 years. Perhaps he will get a chance if he embraces it to reconsider his way of doing his work. In count 4, making a false document, contrary to section 345, 347, that is a sales agreement. A1 and A2 are sentenced to 2 years. It also attracts a maximum sentence of 3 years, but they are sentenced to 2 years. And Bateyo is sentenced to a fine of 3 million. Yes, he is sentenced to a fine of 3 million because he was the master drafter for the sales agreement. To commit a felony contrary to section 390 of the Penal Code Act. A1, it attracts a maximum sentence of 3 years. A1 Ssaalongo and A4 Chris, the masterminds of this case, are sentenced to 2 years each in prison. A3 is sentenced to a fine of 2 million and in default 2 years. I'm still giving him an option of a fine for him to get a second chance as an advocate and think again about his profession. Count 3 of uttering a false document contrary to section 351 and 347 of the Penal Code Act. A1 Ssaalongo, A2 Chris are sentenced 2 years for the same reasons of initiating the whole fraudulent scam. A3 Bateyo is still sentenced to a fine of 2 million and in default to serve 2 years. Perhaps he will get a chance if he embraces it to reconsider his way of doing his work. In count 4, making a false document, contrary to section 345, 347, that is a sales agreement. A1 and A2 are sentenced to 2 years. It also attracts a maximum sentence of 3 years, but they are sentenced to 2 years. And Bateyo is sentenced to a fine of 3 million. Yes, he is sentenced to a fine of 3 million because he was the master drafter for the sales agreement. and in default, he will serve a sentence of 2 years. On all the previous sentences with regard to A3 Bateyo, in default, it is 2 years in prison, except for count number 4, where he's supposed to pay 3 million because he was the master drafter of the sales agreement. Then conspiracy to commit a felony, that is still forgery of the land title. There is conspired. A1, A4, that is Salongo and Chris, 3 years in prison.
Omulamuzi Tumusiime mu kusindika bano ku kibonerezo ekikakali kiti ategeezezza nti Salongo Kaggwa George ne Sally Crispus bamanyirivu mu nsonga y'okujingira ebiwandiiko by'ebyapa by'ettaka.
Count 11 is obtaining money by false pretense. As already indicated, 330 million in total were taken from the complainant. A1, Salongo, A4, Chris. They are sentenced to, the maximum sentence in that case is 5 years, and I've given them the maximum. Because that was their target, to get money. To forge, issue land titles, forge land titles, and get money. So I've given them the maximum sentence, that is 5 years. And as already said, 330 million in total with others was obtained from the complainant. Then A3, Bateyo, since he knew all this, repeat in count number 7 of conspiracy to commit a felony. That is forgery of a sales agreement. Salongo and Chris, 2 years in prison. A3 Bateyo, 3 million fine for being the very person who wrote the agreement, and default 3 years. The other reasons for giving him an optional fine have already been laid down. Count number 8, that is forgery of a land title. This offense was I would say, the most serious under these charges. It attracts life imprisonment. And for that reason, A1, Salongo, and A4, Chris, are sentenced to 10 years in prison. Evidence shows that they were in the business of forging land titles, and they remained unremorseful throughout the case. So I sentenced them to 10 years. It is only A1 and A4 who were sentenced to this. Found guilty of this because Bateyo did not participate in forging the land title. So A1, Salongo, A4, Chris, they are sentenced to 3 years. And this was the best title the best document they could have given the complainant, because that was evidence of ownership. But in fact, it turned out not to be. And this was very unfortunate. And count 11, that is not count 11, count 11 I've already finished. So this was the last count of making a false document. The last count of personation was with regard to A2. A2 is already serving a total imprisonment of 8 years. The lady who posed as the owner of the land. So these ones were, their duty was to hire that lady, Asunta Fraser Luanga, to act as the owner of the land, and for her, she is already reducing on her punishment of 8 years. So those are the orders I've made with regards to the sentences. You have a right to appeal against both the sentences and the judgment I so order. All sentences with regard to A1 and A4 in terms of prison are to run concurrently. They are to run concurrently.
Nze Namamonde Deborah akusakidde bino.